When most people think of the history of modern conservatism, they think of one man, Ronald Reagan. Yet this narrow view leaves many to question, how did Donald Trump win the presidency? And what is the future of the Republican Party? Throughout the years, the conservative movement has evolved from a network of individuals cultivating and institutionalizing a vision that grew over time, eventually having to cater to new pressures, balanced with its desire for mainstream acceptance. Our guest today argues that the more one studies conservatism's past, the more one becomes convinced of its future. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Kirsten Cullenberg, Director of Programs at the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Welcome to our virtual program with Matthew Continetti, moderated by Eliana Johnson. A reminder to our viewers that you can purchase a copy of Matthew's book, The Right, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism, online right now through our partners at Interrobang Books. Go to interrobangbooks.com to order from this fantastic local bookstore. If you aren't yet a member of the World Affairs Council, please join us. We'd love to welcome you to our community of engaged citizenry right here in DFW. Visit dfwworld.org for more information on membership options. I'd like to quickly recognize the Council's new institutional partner, NEC Corporation of America, as we are so thrilled to have them on board with us as dedicated members. Thank you. The Council is committed to providing a safe environment for our guests at our in-person events. We have updated our mask policy to align with CDC standards, and you can find out more information about our health and safety practices when we do operate in person and our complete event list on our website. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for this program this evening, journalist Eliana Johnson. Eliana is a regular presence on cable news and has appeared on NBC's Meet the Press, CBS's Face the Nation, PBS NewsHour, and ABC's This Week, among others. Eliana has worked as Washington editor for the National Review and for Politico as national political reporter. She is currently the editor-in-chief for the Washington Free Beacon, which was co-founded by our guest this evening, Matthew Continetti. And now, Eliana, I invite you to take it away. Lead us down a fantastic conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. I am honored to welcome our guest this evening, a friend, a colleague, a journalist, and scholar who, in his new book, The Right, explores the evolution of conservatives and conservatism in the 20th century. Matt Continetti is senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on political thought and history. He has been published in, among other places, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and most importantly, you can find his weekly column at the Washington Free Beacon. Matt is a frequent commentator on Fox News, Bret Baier's panel on Special Report, and he often holds down the right-wing seat on NBC's Meet the Press on Sundays. He is also a contributing editor at National Review. His book, The Right, 100-Year War for American Conservatism, which you should all buy, is a sweeping and definitive account of the evolution of the conservative movement from the progressive era through the present. Matt, I have lots and lots of questions to ask you about your book, and I thought about organizing this conversation. I wanted to ask you first about the history and then turn to current events, specifically to Trump, I think, who is on, I'm sure, all of our minds. But first, I wonder if you could help us define our terms and some of the terms that you use in your book. What is the right? What is the conservative movement? And what is the Republican Party for the purposes of the conversation that we'll have for the next hour?
Sure. Thank you, Eliana, and thank you to the Council for hosting me this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. It is important to define one's terms, and I spent a little bit of time doing that at the beginning of the book. The book is called The Right, and what the right means to me is basically everybody who is opposed to the left. And these categories of left and right come to us from the French Revolution, and they have shaped our politics ever since. Within that broad category of the right, however, there is American conservatism. and specifically post-war American conservatism. And it's my argument in the book that the right can include many groups opposed to the left, but who might also be opposed in some ways to what makes America distinctive, opposed to constitutional rule of law, opposed to the separation of church and state, opposed to our free market economy. Unlike the American conservative movement, which comes into being after World War II, which was very much tied to America, a defense of America, a defense of our founding institutions, a defense of our rule of law, our civil society, and of our market economy. So there's the right. Then within the right, there's American conservatism. And then finally, there's the Republican Party. And of course, many people view all of these terms as synonymous. But one of the lessons of my history is that was not always the case, and in some ways still is not the case. The Republican Party is a political institution. It was formed in 1854. It, of course, came into prominence with Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860. It has a long history, a history that predates post-war American conservatism. And the Republican Party is really an institution that's going to be shaped and directed by the people who inhabit it. And for much of the first half of my history, the people who inhabited and controlled the Republican Party did not identify with the post-war conservative movement. And there's no reason to expect that the Republican Party would or will continue to be or will always be a vehicle for conservative ideas. It's going to be shaped by the people in charge. So there's the right, there's the conservative movement that comes out of World War II, and then there's the Republican Party, which has always been a battleground for conservatives who want to use the Republican Party to shape America and the world, as well as people who don't agree with conservatism, and then other forces on the right who may have principled disagreements with conservatism just from a different direction.
The subtitle of your book is The 100-Year War for American Conservatism. And at the risk of collapsing your history into 3 minutes, can you give us like a brief overview of this war? Who are the participants in the war? And what are a couple of the most important battles and turning points in this war? And finally, who has the upper hand in this war today?
Sure, I'll unpack that question. So the book subtitle is The War for American Conservatism. Well, why is it a war, or why is it a struggle? It's because just as we defined our terms of the right, conservatives, and the Republican Party, within the conservative movement, there are a variety of points of view. There are some people who stress liberty. There are other people who stress tradition, but who still kind of found themselves united in the battle against communism in the 20th century. And so I wrote this book in some ways to combat the idea that conservatism is one thing. It's not monolithic. It's not uniform. There are many different things. There are many different thinkers, and they've always been in tension and sometimes in conflict with one another. So when I start the book in the 1920s, the figures who I discuss, Presidents Harding and Coolidge, some of the thinkers associated with the New Humanism, H.L. Mencken and Albert J. Nock, very famous journalists at the time, they didn't think of themselves as conservative. They thought they were just kind of standing for the status quo, what they assumed to be the standard way of doing things, definitely not the progressive way of doing things that was embodied by the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. But people like Harding and Coolidge represented what they called Americanism, or what Harding called normalcy, very famously. It's not until after the New Deal, after Franklin Delano Roosevelt really changes the nature of the American social contract, greatly expands the size and scope of the federal government in unprecedented ways, that the people who come out of the tradition of Harding and Coolidge begin to think of themselves as conservatives, because they found themselves defending what they saw as the inheritance of the Constitution against FDR's expansion of the executive branch, against his centralization of power in Washington, D.C., against the extraordinary powers he gave to unelected bureaucrats and regulatory agencies. That's really how conservatism comes into being. But there's a big battle over foreign policy at the end of World War II. And this is one of the decisive moments in my history, where the pre-World War II right had been very isolationist. They were what I call, following the Professor Alan Lichtman, disengaged nationalists. They were American nationalists. They believed in American strength. They believed in American military might, but they were disengaged from the world. They thought involvement in the world would only bring America problems. After World War II, because of the threat of communism, the right switches its foreign policy to one of engaged nationalism. And you see through a debate, intellectual debate on the right, through the creation of new institutions on the right, American conservatism in the post-war years really transform itself into a tough-minded, forward-leaning anti-communist force, supportive of alliances like NATO, supportive of deploying American forces overseas, supportive of free trade in order to grow our allied economies. That's a key struggle. But I would say another key struggle that develops throughout the course of the book is the dynamic between conservative institutionalists or elitists and conservative populists. So on the one hand, you have conservatives who think that the way to best shape America is to retain credibility with the mainstream, to basically change the opinions of the elites who inhabit our positions of authority in our key institutions, political, economic, cultural, social. On the other hand, you have the populists, the people who believe that the experts are ruining everything, the people who believe the experts don't actually understand that America is not ruled from above, that it's driven from below. And there's this suspicion of elites and of that type of gradual shaping of opinion that the intellectuals want to pursue on the part of the populists. And so I trace several moments in the course of my history, a recurring cycle of occasional cooperation between the intellectuals and the elites and the populist grassroots, but then also conflict. And just to bring it to the present moment, as you mentioned in your question, I think beginning in around 2006, the cooperation between the conservative elites based in Washington, D.C. primarily, and the grassroots populists spread throughout the country came to an end. And I should say that President George W. Bush was effective at synthesizing these two forces throughout his first term in office. But in his second term, that synthesis fell apart. And it was over issues such as Social Security personal accounts. It was over issues such as simmering discontent with the way that the war in Iraq was going. It was going badly, as we will recall. And also primarily a revolt among the grassroots right, the populist right, over George W.'s proposal to liberalize American immigration law. And so I kind of traced the beginning of this rupture to that era, around 2006, 2007. It runs through the emergence of Sarah Palin in 2008. It runs through the Tea Party beginning in 2009. And of course, it culminates in the Trump phenomenon, which we are still living through today.
I'm going to come back to a bunch of the points you made. You refer in your book to a conventional narrative of the conservative movement, and write in your introduction that your book pushes back against this so-called conventional narrative. Can you talk a little bit about what is the conventional narrative that many of us who grew up, on the center right, learned about how the conservative movement came to be, and where does your book depart from it?
Sure. Well, the story that the American conservative movement tells itself is that there was no conservatism in America prior to World War II, and that the post-war conservative movement was the first self-consciously conservative movement in American politics. And it was on the margins of American intellectual discourse. It was on the margins of American politics coming out of World War II. And then slowly it built institutions in the 1950s. It helped nominate Barry Goldwater in 1964. It lost badly in 1964. But in 1980, with Ronald Reagan, conservatism came to power in Washington, where it has remained challenged, of course, sometimes out of power, as it is now at the federal level, but still a huge force in American politics. And even if Donald Trump represented a change, the post-war conservative movement has largely acclimated itself to what Trump represents. My issue with this narrative is twofold, and I'll start with the point first that it tends to kind of soften the edges. It's kind of too pat. The fact is that the history of the American right over the last 100 years, like all history, is extremely contingent. It depends on accident. It was not inevitable in any way, shape, or form. And also, conservatives tend to downplay the sinister elements within their movement that have appeared from time to time. And so my history tries to address that weakness and point out some of the problems that American conservatives have faced from within their movement over the course of the century. The second reason that I depart from that conventional narrative is that Ronald Reagan looms too large in it. Now, I'm a huge Reagan fan. My conservatism draws a lot from Ronald Reagan's. But I find that as I study the history of the American right, Ronald Reagan is a very unique figure. His personality was very unusual among the figures in the American right. His principles were slightly different than you find among many conservatives. He was much more future-oriented. He was much sunnier and optimistic than conservatives, especially conservative intellectuals, have tended to be.
I don't think anybody would describe us that way, Matt.
No, probably not. I try to be sunny.
Optimistic.
So he's kind of strange, and even his biographers have found it hard to really understand him. And yet he looms so large in these stories. So I thought, well, why don't we expand the cast of characters? And in order to do that, why don't we begin this history, the right, much earlier than most of the histories that have been written over the last few decades about the American right? Why don't we begin it in 1920? Why don't we begin it before the New Deal, before World War II? And when you do that, two things happen. The first thing is that Reagan is not the central character in the story. He's not the standard of the American right? He is one protagonist in the story, a story that contains many characters. And two, when you take a wider view, when you look at 100 years instead of, say, 75 years, you find that the Republican Party of Donald Trump in many ways resembles the Republican Party of Calvin Coolidge. Now, this is not to compare Donald Trump and Calvin Coolidge, who were extremely different people, very different personalities, different backgrounds, certainly different governing styles. But if you look at the kind of political tonalities of their parties, there are some similarities. Calvin Coolidge's Republican Party was protectionist. It wanted to insulate America industry from the gales of creative destruction in the international economy. Calvin Coolidge's Republican Party was restrictionist. It essentially banned immigration to the United States for 40 some years. Calvin Coolidge's Republican Party was skeptical of foreign intervention. Harding, who wins in 1920, really campaigns saying that he would restore normalcy. He's campaigning against Woodrow Wilson's proposal for the League of Nations. There's an idea on the American right coming out of the First World War that was a terrible experience that should not be repeated. And so there was a reluctance on the part of many on the American right in the 1920s and the 1930s to become involved overseas. And so when you look at the party of Donald Trump today, you see similar things. You see a return to protectionism, especially in the case of China, trade with China. You see hawkishness on the border, a campaign against illegal immigration, and you're beginning to see some proposals to reform legal immigration as well. And you also see a skepticism of foreign intervention that may have slightly wavered with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But when you look at what Republicans are willing to do vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine, you find that they are still skeptical of becoming directly involved in that conflict. So I'd say that's why my narrative departs from some of the more standard histories that have been produced over the years, many of which are very good and I recommend. But my book, I think, needed to be a little bit different.
I want to fast forward to and talk a little bit about Trump. You mentioned about 10 minutes ago the George W. Bush presidency as the beginning, I think, of a rupture or estrangement between conservative elites and their voters, and that culminated in Trump's election. Can you expound on that a little bit? What do you mean by that? And how did it lead us to Trump?
Well, there's always been some tension between the grassroots populists who live throughout the country and who are often responsible for putting Republicans in office, and kind of the conservative journalists and policy wonks who live in Washington, D.C. primarily these days, but earlier also New York City. With George W. Bush, as I was saying earlier, he campaigned in 2000 and presented himself throughout his first term as really just one of the folks, as the normal guy. Remember in the 2000 campaign, everyone was asking, which candidate would you like to have a beer with, right? And that was a contest that W won, right? And of course, he was an evangelical Christian. His faith was deeply important to him, as it continues to be. And so he seemed to be a bridge between the grassroots and, of course, the establishment. You can't get more establishment than being a member of the Bush family, right? Beginning in his second term, however, I think some ruptures occurred between what Bush was attempting to do and the sentiments of many grassroots populists around the country. I focus on immigration because I think it continues to be a huge issue that animates the right and populism on the right. And this is an issue where George W. Took a different view than many on his party who identified as conservatives, and certainly the more populist right. He wanted to have border security, but he also wanted to liberalize immigration law and legalize illegal immigrants who had been here and not broken other laws. This was not popular among the grassroots right. And you began to see that the plan would go nowhere because of the opposition on the grassroots right, which was extremely prevalent on the talk radio right. You also saw in 2008 something weird happen, which was, or perhaps unexpected. A gadfly candidate, also from Texas, Congressman Ron Paul, emerges as kind of a YouTube sensation in the 2008 campaign, and really kind of a popular candidate among young people on the right in particular. And Ron Paul's issues, of course, were his opposition to the war in Iraq and his opposition to the Federal Reserve and the Fed. And at the time, many people simply dismissed the Ron Paul liberty movement as kind of almost a vestigial tick on the right, of that old right that pre-World War II right that I talk about in my book. In retrospect, however, I think it was an important sign of simmering discontent on the right, among the right grassroots toward Bush's foreign policy. The war in Iraq, beginning especially in 2006, went south very quickly. There was a sense that, of course, there had already been a discussion in 2002 within the right about whether the war was a good idea to begin with, and I get into that in the book as well. And the direction of the war in Iraq in those final years emboldened and empowered the critics of the war. There was also, you could see with the Ron Paul movement, the return of many elements on the grassroots that conservative elites and conservative intellectuals had thought had been kind of cabined off, put away. But by the time you get to the end of the Bush presidency, you have two very important things happen. One is that John McCain selects Sarah Palin, the little-known governor of Alaska, as his running mate in the campaign. And the effect on American politics of that nomination is seismic and deeply polarizing, very much a preview of what was to come in American politics. And then you have the global financial crisis in September of 2008 and the onset of the Great Recession, when we do know through academic research that populism doesn't need a bad economy to thrive, but it certainly gains a lot of energy from bad economies. And so it was the combination of, I think, the final years of the Bush presidency and then the global financial crisis. And on top of that, Barack Obama's governing style during his first term that really delegitimized that conservative governing class, which had come to power with Reagan and been consolidated under Gingrich and under the two Bushes, in the eyes of many people on the grassroots right. And it led to the much more populist right, the much more national populist right that we have today.
Matt, I covered the Trump campaign, and from my vantage point on the campaign trail, Trump looked like an aberration. But you write in your book that when you study the sweep of the right and the conservative movement, that Trump, his candidacy and his presidency were not actually an aberration, that he does fit into the sweep of American conservatism. Make your case.
Well, I would say he fits into the sweep of the American right that I talk about in the book. And then I'll get to the conservative part in a second. I trace in my book moments where the conservatives and the right were swept up in populist moments that led to demagogic figures and leadership. And so I discussed the McCarthy moment and the second Red Scare in the book. I spent a lot of time discussing the presidential candidacies of Alabama Governor George Wallace and what he represented, and the populism that he campaigned on, in the late 60s and 70s, after he kind of had diminished the role of, just explicit segregation and racism in his campaigns. I talk about Pat Buchanan and the real choice that the Republican Party faced in that period between 1988 and 1992, and also 1996, when Pat Buchanan runs again for the Republican nomination, about which direction the party would take. Would it take the party, would it try to go in the Bush direction? Would it try to expand that conservative governing class I talked about, try to uphold a international system that relied on free and open trade and was underpinned by American military strength and our forward deployment of forces and alliance structure? Or would it go in the direction Buchanan wanted it to go, which was protectionist, which was restrictionist, and which was America First? America First, of course, was the organization that was spearheaded by and whose main spokesman was the aviator Charles Lindbergh in 1940 through 41, opposing American entry into the Second World War. It's Buchanan who rehabilitates that slogan in 1990 during discussions of where American foreign policy should go at the end of the Cold War. And of course, it's Donald Trump who also takes America First as his slogan beginning in 2016. So when you look at it from that point of view, there are many precursors to Trump, even though Trump's personality is very unique. If you look at the issues that he's emphasizing, and if you look at, of course, at the style of leadership he embodies, the fighter, the one who's not going to play by any rules, the one who's willing to kind of go to the edge and also polarize and also attract these huge crowds. There are definitely antecedents for what Trump represented.
Should we understand Trump as a McCarthyite figure or a George Wallace type figure?
Well, I mean, I think he's different in some ways, and even those two figures are different from each other. Maybe I think the way I would put it is we should see the reception to him in similar ways. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. One was with McCarthy. I discuss how supportive many of the founders of the post-war conservative movement were of Joe McCarthy's campaign to root out communist infiltration in the executive branch of government. And I always talk about how if you read the issue of National Review magazine, the main conservative journal that was published after McCarthy dies in 1957, it's like his head of state has died. There are just huge pouring out of support for McCarthy. And very interestingly, the intellectuals make a similar case for McCarthy that intellectual supportive of Trump would make it for Trump, which is that he's not right all the time. Sometimes he's counterproductive. But on the big issue, the issue of communism and its threat, he was right. And so you see that, I think, today as well with defenses of President Trump. Maybe he goes too far. He doesn't have the right personality sometimes. He exaggerates, of course, but he's right about America and his view of America, and it's under threat. With Wallace, it was very interesting for me to study the reception of Wallace on the American right during the 1970s, again, after Wallace had just dropped the explicit support for segregation. And whenever National Review criticized Wallace, which it did often, because National Review was critical of Wallace's populism, there would always be letters saying that they would cancel subscribers canceling their subscriptions, and also letters saying, the thing that you kind of nerdy intellectuals in New York don't understand about George Wallace is that he fights. He fights. And of course, the thing that many people who support Donald Trump today will say is, the thing that you nerdy intellectuals in Washington, D.C. don't understand about Donald Trump is he fights. So I'm not saying that he is the same person or that he's standing for the same things as those individuals. What I am saying is that the reception to him has very interesting parallels with the reception of those other individuals on the American right. And then just as an asterisk, and since I promised to get to this, the interesting thing about Trump is that many members of the conservative movement had great doubts about whether he would be a conservative. And those doubts were largely settled in Trump's favor once he began his presidency. And the irony about Donald Trump, this national populist leader, this guy who doesn't really, conform to any of the niceties or the Marquess of Queensberry rules, is that he largely put into place the agenda that the elite conservatives had wanted for a long time. If you think about his two lasting accomplishments as president, they were the tax reform. That was a long-standing goal of the supply side economists, as well as Paul Ryan, former House Speaker Paul Ryan. And it was his change of the federal judiciary, including his 3 Supreme Court appointments, which was a long-standing goal of the Federalist Society, the conservative legal movement, and Senate now minority leader, Mitch McConnell. So I think many conservatives found themselves very pleased with the way that Trump governed as president, which is why he did gain many votes in the 2020 election, just not enough to win.
I want to ask you one more question before turning it over to the audience and taking some questions from them. Matt, you've been very outspoken in your criticisms of Trump, particularly around his conduct on January 6th. Both of us have a lot of reporter friends, and many of my friends covering both the Biden White House and former President Trump and his orbit, they think Biden is going to run again, and they think Trump is going to run again. And my final question to you is there anybody on the right who you think could mount a serious challenge to Trump in a Republican primary? And what would your advice be to other Republicans who are not named Trump looking at presidential runs? Do they have a shot?
It's funny. I've seen reports, in addition to the ones that you mentioned, that Bernie Sanders might run again, and even that Hillary Clinton is kind of out there, kind of snooping around, seeing if there's an opportunity for her to make a return, which means that essentially we've been stuck in time since 2015. We've been frozen in place politically, and we're just, it seems, destined to relive the 2016 cycle over and over again. It also means that we're still in the Trump era. I thought that era ended on January 6th, 2021. I was wrong. And Trump remains the central figure in the Republican Party. The question is just, how far does his influence run? He had a very good week last week. His Supreme Court appointments were part of this majority that signed on to Justice Alito's draft opinion overturning Roe v. Wade. We don't know if it's the final opinion. I think that's one reason Trump hasn't been bragging about it, is that he's waiting to see if it's the final opinion. But if it is the final opinion, that is the greatest success of the conservative legal movement in its 40-year history. On top of that, Trump endorsed the winning candidate in the very competitive Ohio Senate primary, J.D. Vance. And so he can boast that he picked the winner of the Ohio primary. However, if you look at the primaries that were held yesterday, he kind of had a split decision. His candidate he endorsed won a House primary in West Virginia. And yet his candidate in the Nebraska Republican governor's primary didn't win. And he had gone after Representative Don Bacon for Bacon's support of the bipartisan infrastructure deal, and Bacon won. So that's a split decision. And we're going into a primary next week in Pennsylvania that many people are paying attention to. That looks like a dead heat right now. And if anything, it seems as though the anti-MAGA establishment candidate. So there's an establishment Republican candidate, then there's the MAGA establishment candidate, Dr. Oz, and now there's like an anti-MAGA establishment candidate. She's MAGA, Kathy Barnett, but she's not part of the MAGA establishment. But she just seems to be surging right now, and Trump did not endorse her. So there's the sense that maybe even some parts of the MAGA movement are outpacing Trump. What that suggests is perhaps he's not quite as influential as he might appear. He's frozen the field in place. However, I think there are several Republicans who are considering a run for president, no matter what Trump decides. And I think there is a potential that he could lose a primary. I don't think it's a great potential, but I do think it's a potential. I look at somebody like Governor DeSantis of Florida, someone who I think shows a lot of Trump supporters a way to actually implement a Trumpian agenda of attacking the cultural power centers of the progressive left, and doing so in a way that seems to be effective. Whether the agenda holds up in court or not, it's enough for the populist grassroots. They really like DeSantis. And I think Trump himself is kind of wary of DeSantis. I think that's the biggest challenge right now. But this cycle could also bring new names to the fore. We just don't know. Of course, Trump benefits from a divided field. And many people overlook the fact that Trump did not win a majority of the votes in the 2016 Republican primary. He won about 45% of the votes. But that was enough to win a majority of the delegates because the field was so fractured. And in a fractured field that doesn't consolidate behind one non-Trump alternative, I think the advantage is to Trump in his renomination in 2024.
Matt, you just touched on this with your reference to Governor DeSantis and the way he has shown voters that he will fight on cultural issues. When you talked about the emergence of the conservative movement post-World War II, it was about pushing back on the size and scope of government, and particularly on the New Deal agenda. That is not really where the right or conservatives are fighting now. And you talk about a transition from battles over the size of government, primarily post-World War II, to battles over cultural issues. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you think the focus of those political battles has shifted to the cultural battles that are at the center of our politics today.
Well, one reason is that our values are just contested and have been since the late 1960s. And it seems to be that every 30 years or so, we go through a moment of, since the 60s anyway, every 30 years, we go through kind of this cultural reevaluation of which values should be supreme. What does it mean to be an American? Who gets to be an American? I think it also has something to do, Eliana, with the changing nature of the Republican Party. The Republican Party today is largely composed of people who benefited from the New Deal, who benefit from some of the Great Society programs like Medicare and Medicaid. There's less of a desire on the part of these Republicans to challenge things like Social Security, unemployment insurance, Medicare and Medicaid. They're more interested in the cultural agenda. They become Republicans because they're rebelling against the progressive left and its political correctness. And Donald Trump understands that. He never wanted to tackle the Paul Ryan agenda, say, of reforming Social Security and Medicare. I noticed that President Biden recently attacked Senator Scott of Florida, someone else who was thinking of running for president in 2024, and attacked him specifically on his proposed, those sketchy entitlement reform plans in the agenda he released. That's something Donald Trump wouldn't do. That's something that J.D. Vance wouldn't do, the Republican nominee in Ohio. So I think as a combination of those two things, one, the kind of recurring cycle of debate over values, and two, the changing composition of the Republican Party, and also, of course, of the Democratic Party as well, right? The Democratic Party, now primarily composed in its upper echelons of highly educated, upwardly mobile men and women who are connected in some ways with the commanding heights of our economy. So the university sector, the nonprofit sector, entertainment, culture, media. They have a set of values that they desire to be supreme as well. For those reasons, we've shifted the terrain of our debate. We're not fighting over rolling back the Great Society, rolling back the New Deal. We're fighting over what does it mean to be American? What should our view of America history should be? What is America's place in the world? And who gets to be an American?
Okay, we have audience questions rolling in, so I'm going to turn it over. Question from Bethany. Do you think Republicans who don't support Trump will continue with the GOP to try and keep the party from splitting more?
It's a very interesting question. I think many of those Republicans will return to the fold in 2022. And I still expect this to be a good year for Republicans. There are going to be races where candidates make gaffes that lose the race for the Republican candidate. But I think in the main, it's shaping up to be a very good year, precisely because Republicans who may have serious doubts about Trump, he's not on the ballot, so that they can vote against Democrats. In 2024, though, I think you would see a similar effect that we saw in 2020, which was that the Republican Party ran ahead of Donald Trump in both 2016 and 2020. The senators who were elected in both of those cycles earned more votes than Donald Trump did. The House candidates, we picked up over a dozen seats, the GOP, in 2020. They ran ahead of Donald Trump. Glenn Youngkin, the new governor of Virginia, he ran ahead of Donald Trump in Trump counties in southwestern Virginia. The voters who don't like Trump and who voted down ballot for Republicans in 2020, but left that top space blank, which cost Trump the election, Trump would have to do a lot to convince them. And his opponent would have to do a lot to convince them to earn his vote again. It's different running for the first time against Hillary Clinton in 2016, when Hillary Clinton is just slightly less unpopular than you are if you're Donald Trump, and she represents the establishment in a change election. And running against in 2020, when many people, independents, suburban voters, they were just tired of the drama. They just wanted the drama to stop. Now, of course, I think they have buyer's remorse. They don't like the way that Biden is governing, because Biden didn't recognize that he got an anti-mandate. He didn't get a mandate to be FDR. He got a mandate not to be Donald Trump. That's an anti-mandate. But faced with Trump again in 2024, I think a lot would have to change for those voters to come back and put Trump back in the White House again. I'm not saying it's impossible. I've learned my lessons, but I think it would be hard.
Next question is, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, from Kais. What, in your view, is the biggest internal and external threat to modern conservatism?
Well, the biggest external threat to modern conservatism, that's a very good question. Conservatism has always had to deal with cancellation. It's always had to deal with liberal media bias. This is a long-running fight that the right has had in American politics, and I trace that in my book. Nothing new there. But the dearth of conservative professors in particular, I think, is a huge problem. One of the reasons I wrote this book is that I teach this material and have for half a dozen years. And at the end of one course, I asked my students what surprised them about the course. And a student raised his hand and he said, "I'm surprised that any of this exists." He had never really known about National Review and all its internal battles, or all the conservative magazines that have existed. all the great conservative books like Russell Kirk's books or Whittaker Chambers's books. He didn't know about what supply side economics actually was, the theory behind it, the books that were written to expound it. And so young people don't have access to these ideas in a way that they even had 20 years ago, say, just because those professors are gone that might point them in that direction. You can still find it online, but it takes some work and it's easy to get distracted by the noise. So maybe I would put that as an external threat. And the internal threat, though, is in falling into bad habits and falling into conspiracy theory in particular, falling into scapegoating, falling into support for a strongman and not respecting the Constitution. There's no American conservatism without the American Constitution. And we need to adhere to that document above all if we're to call ourselves conservatives in America.
Matt, Raymond asks, and I know you'll have views on this, whether there are similarities between Republicans and Democrats with respect to foreign policy, sending troops overseas, bringing the troops home, and so on. And I would just add, if so, what are the similarities? Are we seeing a convergence or a bipartisan moment on the right and left?
Well, to the degree that we're seeing a bipartisan moment right now as we meet, it's a bipartisanship in support of internationalism. If you look at the main stream of both parties in Congress, they are very supportive of American support for Ukraine. They just passed the latest tranche of aid, the Lend-Lease. So that, I think, is reassuring for those of us who think that America is a force for good in the world and America needs to support small countries when they're attacked by tyrants. Foreign policy is an unusual thing because there's cross-cutting pressures. You can have a wide range of foreign policy views in both the Democratic and Republican parties. So in the Democratic Party, you have, say, Bernie Sanders on one end and Chris Coons on the other. And in the Republican Party, you have, a hawk like Tom Cotton on one end, and you have Rand Paul on the other, right? I would say, though, that there is definitely there was, prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, growing consensus in favor of non-interventionism, in the sense that America should not be involved in the world as much as it had been in the 1990s and early 2000s. But, as I said at the outset of our conversation, history is contingent, history is unplanned, accidental, and occasionally random. And I have been surprised and struck in the weeks the months now, since the Russian invasion, that the public continues to support Ukraine, doesn't want to become directly involved, but does support America's continued aid to Ukraine in its resistance against the Russian invasion.
Matt, Jack asks whether you think Trump's conviction, if it happens, on either sexual attacks on women or fraud in business transactions would derail him, or would his populist base overlook it? Not sure they're mutually exclusive, but go ahead.
Well, I think Trump was right when he said back in 2016 that he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and his base would still be with him. He's always concerned about being right with the base, and that core support that follows him around the country, that does the boat parades and the truck convoys in support for him, they'll always be behind him. I do think, though, his continued legal problems, if they continue, would pose a problem with him in the sense that, those Republican primary voters who I say might support Trump and thought he was a good president, an effective president, support the Trump agenda, such as it was, the combination of more traditional conservatism along with the national populism issue, and most importantly, probably that fighting spirit, that willingness to go on the offensive, especially against the liberal media. They might say, look, Trump, he had his moment. We need to find another guy in the mold, but who just doesn't have that baggage. I've heard that from many Republicans in recent weeks. So continued legal trouble would just, I think, maybe push a few more voters in that direction.
Matt, Mary asks whether you could talk about what you view as the dark side of American conservatism, and particularly the tendency toward violence among some Trump supporters. I'm guessing that's a reference to January 6th.
Of course. I mean, I think that was a very visible manifestation of the dark side of the right. I trace several moments like this in my book. But for me, and that we haven't really discussed it here, I do dwell on the post-war conservative movement's opposition to the civil rights movement. This was unusual because the civil rights Republicans, Eisenhower and Nixon, passed civil rights legislation in 1957 and 1959. It was Republican senators who helped get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 across the finish line. And yet the founders of the post-war conservative movement were opposed to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and some of them on frankly racist grounds. Not Barry Goldwater, who famously voted against it. He had constitutional concerns with the legislation. But others, including William F. Buckley Jr., a major protagonist of my history, said some things that I feel the conservative movement has never really put behind him. And I feel as though that limited conservatives' appeal over time. Its opposition to the civil rights movement, it didn't broaden it.
Last question, Matt, from Alfie. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but if Roe is in fact overturned, what will the impact, do you think, be on the midterms?
I wish I knew, because then I could see the future and I'd be a rich man. At the moment, I don't think it will be enough to overcome the declining standard of living in this country as a result of the inflation. But I do think it will play a role in some races, and it has the potential to be a major issue. But at the moment, it has not risen in voter priority or voter intensity beyond the very active forces we see protesting outside of people's homes.
I see Kirsten's face popping back on the screen, which I know is my cue to turn it back over to her. Matt, thank you so much for doing this. And thank you to all of you for joining. This has been a wonderful hour. And Kirsten, I will hand it back over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Eliana. You too, I could hear you talk for another hour. Matthew, I'm just learning from you. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. A quick reminder to our audience that you can purchase copies of Matthew's book, The Right, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism, online right now through our partners at Interrobang Books. Please visit interrobangbooks.com to order from this fantastic local bookstore right here in our backyard. If you're not yet a member of the World Affairs Council, please join us. Visit dfwworld.org for more information on membership and programs that we have coming up.